I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who can introduce David.
So, welcome. This is David Corris. He is the Executive Director of MRDA, not MRDA. And he's here tonight from the Connecticut Municipal Redevelopment Authority to give the town an overview of the authority, technical assistance, and housing growth zones for an opportunities potentially and hopefully for Old Saybrook. So thank you for joining us and welcome.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me. So I think I'll give you a brief overview of kind of how MRDA came about and what it is that we're task force, about how we're going to operate, sort of where we are in our process, and what the next steps would be if Old Saybrook elects to work with us. And I think that's a crucial point from the outset, is we are a voluntary opt-in discretionary program that municipalities can choose to take advantage of or not. We do not bring sticks. We do not bring, by any means, a heavy-handed approach to developing housing within the state of Connecticut. I think we are based on a very strong opinion held by my board that I work for, held by the governor, that there are plenty of communities within the state of Connecticut that do want to find ways to develop housing that fit with their strategy for economic development, that fit with their strategy for meeting the needs of their population, that fit with their long-term growth projections, but they might need some support. And that could be technical support, it could be some additional resources, it could be financial, it could be capacity. And we are hopefully going to evolve to a place where we can be a toolkit that gets mobilized differently for each town or city that we work with, bringing the particular gap, expertise, capacity, resources, financing that are best suited to meet the needs of each individual community. So first and foremost, I'll talk a bit about the history of the legislation and sort of how it evolved over the last few years. And for that, it's important to take a step back, actually about a decade, because it was early in the Malloy administration when the General Assembly, in coordination with the executive branch, established an entity called the Capital Region Development Authority. And that authority has a variety of responsibilities. They manage the venues in the state of, in the city of Hartford, the convention center, et cetera. But what was new about their establishment was that they were created to help the city of Hartford and the surrounding 7 municipalities develop more housing within their downtowns. Predominantly commercial conversions, but also some new construction. And there was a recognition that, Hartford in particular had the infrastructure to support growth, had the political will, needed more bodies on the street to support small businesses and their economic development objectives. But the economics of the development projects just didn't work. They didn't pencil out. There needed to be a flexible gap financing entity, and the Capital Region Development Authority was set up to do just that. And they've had a phenomenal success rate. They've developed or helped develop thousands of units within the core of Hartford. It's been tremendously impactful, life on the street. And not surprisingly, at the start of the Lamont administration, Bridgeport, Haven, Waterbury, they said, well, why exactly does Hartford get this dedicated pot of money and this dedicated team of experts to help them with the same thing that we need support with as well? And so in 2019, the General Assembly passed legislation that established the Municipal Redevelopment Authority, and it was basically Capital Region Development Authority gap financing for the other cities in Connecticut outside of Hartford with populations of greater than 75,000. But it wasn't funded, it wasn't populated. COVID struck, it got put on a shelf. We had other priorities in the state. And in 2023, they came back to it, and leadership in the governor's office, leadership in the General Assembly said, we really do want to do this, but let's take a fresh look at it. Why are we limiting it to places with populations of greater than 75,000? There's communities all throughout the state that are trying to build housing in ways that are particularly appropriate for them. Why don't we open it up to everybody? And so the big changes in that legislation were now any municipality outside of Hartford and the contiguous 7, so 161 of the state's 169 municipalities are eligible to join the Municipal Redevelopment Authority, with one caveat: you have to have either a train or bus rapid transit station, existing or planned, and or a downtown. And so we can work with communities that have existing rail stations, planned rail stations, the bus rapid transit system around Hartford, the fast track, or the ones that are planned radiating out from New Haven. But we can also work in communities with a downtown, any place from Middletown to a Torrington to Chester, places that have walkable mixed use centers oriented around some civic buildings, oriented around some public space, oriented along a main street. And so that's sort of the eligibility criteria. So of those 161 municipalities, I don't know how many actually might meet those criteria, 100 or so, but they have to want the support. And so the way that, I guess the other big change in the legislation was, so if you, now that it's open to all these broader municipalities, to have some certainty that we're going to get some outcomes from this process in terms of new housing production, the other thing that was added in was a certification process. And so the legislation technically says approval of local zoning. I think that's a bit of a misnomer, because we do not usurp any local zoning authority, any local land use controls. We do not take that authority away from the municipality in any way, but we do come in and look at your zoning and determine whether or not, and the statutory language is whether or not it will facilitate a substantial increase in the number of dwelling units. Now, on the one hand, that's very subjective. On the other hand, it's appropriate, because substantial in New Haven is very different than substantial in Old Saybrook. And so we want to make sure that we have the ability to sort of tailor our assessment to what is meaningful growth for each individual municipality, contributing towards this larger objective of trying to house the future population of the state. And so to that end, it's essentially a 4-step process, and I'll get to the carrot at the end of the path in a moment. But first and foremost, the municipality needs to opt in through action by its local legislative body, and that's just the intent to talk, basically, to formally engage with one another, to roll up our sleeves, to look at a map, to talk about the zoning, and see whether or not we might be able to work together. Then we look at the local zoning. And in some instances, we may look at a zone, a TOD zone around a train station, and say, yeah, you're there. That zone meets our criteria. We might, on another zone or in a municipality that doesn't have a zone that yet meets our criteria, we might say, hey, we encourage you to do X, Y, and Z. At that point, you can opt not to do that, right? Our conversations can then be over for the time being. Or you can say, yeah, you know what, we're open to some of those changes. We'll do them with our in-house staff. Or quite a few municipalities, we expect, will say, yeah, we're open to some of those changes. Can you help us? Can you help us draft some of the zoning? Can you help us do some of the analysis to better understand what the fiscal impact to our municipal budget will be if that zoning were to be built out? And we have a cadre of on-call consultants that we will mobilize in support of our partner municipalities to go through some of that analytical work to answer some of those questions. And once we've certified the zoning, which again could be a check in the box because it's already in place, then we enter into an MOU with the chief elected official that designates the development district boundaries. And the restrictions of that is the boundaries have to either be within a half a mile of a transit station, within a downtown, and they have to have the zoning that we've certified, right? So one way to think about it is if you draw a half a mile radius around a train station, that's about 500 acres. We may work with a community where 300 of those acres might be zoned single family, and that's fine. But 100 of those acres are zoned with a zone or zones that we have certified will produce housing. And so that would be the boundaries of the district, those 200 acres of the half a mile radius that has zone or zones that we have certified. Once the boundaries are set, then either the municipality or developers or property owners therein can apply to us for funding. And that funding, we suspect, will either go to gap financing, low interest loans designed to meet the needs of the capital stack. We do not have affordability requirements, but in some instances, we may leverage our investment to achieve that, but it is not a threshold criteria of our funding program. We are about housing production in places that are community appropriate, not necessarily housing for any particular socioeconomic band. We suspect that we may also invest in infrastructure, and that could be infrastructure related to a particular site development, streetscape, or a sewer connection, or it could be infrastructure meant to unlock the potential of a larger district. Sewer extension, flood risk reduction infrastructure, road reconfiguration, pedestrian bridge, right? Any number of things that we could imagine that would add enough value to a series of properties so that then their economics works better on their own, and then maybe we don't need to invest in the gap for the individual projects. So I'll tell you a bit about kind of where we are now. So we have a $60 million bond authorization from the current fiscal year. We do suspect, or expect, I guess I should say, that in the next biennial budget, that will be increased twofold, threefold, somewhere in that order of magnitude, somewhere between 100 and 150, 200 million. We expect that we'll have available between now and the end of FY27. I started July 29th, and so for the last 5 months or so, about half of my time has been creating a quasi-public authority from scratch and everything that goes into that with policies and procedures and building out the operational capacity and procurement. And then the other half of the time is meeting with municipalities and talking through the process and seeing whether or not there's a localized area within the community where it might make sense to work together. I've worked very hard to try and make sure that this program is not just about the big cities. I think it was a very intentional act to remove the population threshold. And so while, you know, the Bridgeports and the New Havens and the Waterburys are of course interested in this funding source and the opportunity that it provides, you know, we want to be working with communities of various sizes in various corners of the state. Shoreline East is certainly an important corridor. We have today, to probably the sort of burning question, so who has signed up so far? So where we are today, we just got legal counsel on board about 40 days ago. I was waiting for them to have a draft resolution template that we could circulate to make sure that that was vetted by council. So we have now sent out a opt-in resolution template to 21 municipalities who have raised their hand and said, we're interested in having that first conversation with our local legislative body. Some of them will plow through that in the next 45 days. Some of them will have their zoning in place. We'll be able to check that box. I think maybe a half a dozen of those will get through the steps and we'll be able to accept project funding applications in June or July. And then the rest of that group and other municipalities that raise their hand month by month will be on a rolling, a rolling adoption. We won't have kind of grant rounds or funding rounds. It'll be a first come, first serve. But I think, you know, with a lot of communities, you know, some that are raising their hand really need more planning support. And so it'll be a smaller allocation of funds and it'll be, you know, a year of working together before there's a pipeline of project. Other communities, yeah, they've got stuff that's entitled, sitting on the sideline, and but for interest rates would have broken ground 6 months ago, and an infusion of kind of mezzanine debt tailored to meet the needs of the project could have a groundbreaking, you know, within this calendar year. So everyone's kind of coming from a different place. And again, communities of all different size. And we want to do what we can, hopefully, to be a resource and some capacity add to help the communities that do decide to work with us to find a strategic approach that makes sense for them, capitalizing on the portions of their communities that are transit accessible, that are walkable, that have the potential to kind of continue to evolve into, mixed use nodes that will add to their grand list and hopefully support local business and add to the quality of life. And, we're confident. I guess one other thing that I'll note, for the communities that are engaged, we're consistently trying to think of ways in which we can add value to support them in ways that go beyond our funding availability. And two things that we're going to be doing are, one, helping with marketing and outreach. So, we suspect we'll be working with a wide range of developers, maybe folks that aren't, that don't have your community on their radar, but they come to us because they're looking for good development opportunities in the state of Connecticut. And so there might be some matchmaking there that we can facilitate. And the other thing that I'm sort of aspirational about, but hopeful that will play a meaningful role in, is not just helping municipalities with their local regulatory framework, but helping align the state regulatory process with the local planning and zoning objectives. And by that, I mean, a lot of other states that I've worked in go to great lengths when they have districts like these with a comprehensive approach that has been locally vetted and supported. They will then navigate that build out through some of the state regulatory process so that individual sites and individual developments don't have to do that as they arise. And so it's a way of saying, once the vision is in place and there's local support around that, if you come in and you're in compliance with zoning, you're not going to have a subsequent multi-year permitting process through things like the Office of State Traffic Administration or flood management certification. And again, I want to be clear, that's aspirational, but I'm having very good conversations with my counterparts across multiple state agencies, and hopefully these very localized target geographies that we work with our municipal partners on can be a model for how to, streamline good development in the places where we want it within the state. Questions?
Lots of digest.
Yeah. Sorry.
So, has there been any consideration to tweaking the legislation? Do you see the legislation as weak in any part of it, or?
Yeah, so there are a couple minor tweaks that we're talking about, but if you have anything in mind, I certainly want to hear it. I mean, the things that we're focused on are very minor, but little things like, this wouldn't be applicable to you, but it says, you can do a district within walking distance of a train station that's in your municipality. Well, there are a couple instances where the station is actually not in your municipality, but walking distance is. We've had a lot of conversations, the legislation says the opt-in has to be done by the local legislative body. What if it's a town meeting community?
Well, that's another, I wrote that down. Board of Selectmen.
Yeah.
By the way, if it was town meeting, we'd have no problem in our community.
Yeah.
But sometimes the legislative body is considered the Board of
Yes,
Selectmen
so
for certain resolutions.
that's high up on my list for tweaks this year.
Yeah, so the half mile.
Yeah.
I mean, I think.
That's another one.
But what you just said, within walking distance of a.
Yeah, so that was me talking. That's not the statute. Yeah,
okay.
so the statute's a half a mile. I consider a walking distance 3/4 of a mile, maybe even a mile.
Yeah,
Where it gets interesting is, it's or a downtown. So in some communities, right, it's gonna be these weird, unique shapes that are particular for that community. And so in one community, right, it may not even go a half a mile to the west of the station because that enters into a single family neighborhood that we don't want to touch. To the other side, maybe the station area becomes the downtown and it can go a mile, 2 miles off in that direction because now you're capturing the downtown.
I mean, Old Saybrook fits that to a T.
Yeah.
With the downtown right to the train station gateway. So, and of course, there's a lot of folks in this room who are very interested in this other area of town that we're really working on, Mariner's Way, that we're calling it, which is beyond a half mile.
Yeah.
So, but, who are some of the, I'm just kicking this off, so maybe this first, I have to run also. Who are the consultants?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, so I actually can't say because
Oh,
the
okay.
board is adopting its on-call consultant list tomorrow.
okay,
But tomorrow I'll be able to send that, and it is, we've gone to great lengths to be inclusive. And so there'll be, it's a relatively long list, because we want flexibility
Right.
if towns have existing relationships to be able to piggyback on our procurement. But the other thing I'll say is it's a mixture of consultants who have a depth of Connecticut experience and some consultants who have a depth of transit-oriented development experience in Massachusetts or New York, who maybe can bring some new ideas to Connecticut.
so I think, so requesting the resolution is as simple as,
Saying, send me the resolution, yeah.
I mean, look, I mean, I'll just generally, this community going back 15, 20 years has just been very open to housing, of all types. The housing at the train station is a radical departure for this town in terms of single family housing, and now we have, but it's been a huge success, I think it has been. So, I mean, we are very interested in it, whether it's whether it's affordable or not. I think we're interested in having more housing and more housing downtown, certainly. I know we're interested, and Chris and I have been talking about this for several months now, so really happy you came down.
Yeah, thanks, appreciate it. Bruce?
So, part of the legislation is the development of this housing growth zone, which is what parameters come into. As you've talked to other places or as you've thought it through, how confined is that? Is that, do you make that, and then if you wanted to do something outside of that, you'd have to create a second, or could you expand? How are you thinking?
Yeah, great question. So the way, I'll answer sort of three different ways, right? So first and foremost, I don't consider housing growth zone something distinct from your zoning. It's whether or not we certify that your MX1 zone or your H4 zone, whatever your existing zones are, whether or not we certify that one or more of them are considered housing growth zones from our perspective. There are many communities that we talk to who say, listen, we want to get started with our TOD zone that we adopted 2 years ago. It only covers 30 acres, but it's in place. And at the outset, we would draw our boundaries around that zone, which does not preclude us from working with the town on a zoning amendment contiguous to that, and then subsequently amending the district boundaries to encompass what has now become a housing growth zone. The final thing that I'll say is, we've talked a bit on the board, and we still need to flesh out some of our parameters, but we've talked a bit about, we don't expect communities that we work with to rezone the entirety of their downtown or the entirety of their station area to meet our housing growth zone objectives. But we also don't want a community to, for lack of a better term, spot zone around a project and say, well, we want support because we've gone through the political hurdles and we like this project. There's going to be some minimum acreage. There's going to be some things so that we know the town is not just thinking about a project that's in the pipeline, but thinking about the broader. And as just like a starting point, just to share, MBTA in Greater Boston has been doing some of this work. They set a minimum of 10 acres. I don't know that that's going to be our threshold, but that's kind of the order of magnitude.
Matt joined us.
Any other questions?
So is this money a grant or a loan or a combination
Yeah.
of resources?
Yeah, so it will depend. It will depend on the project, it'll depend on the community, it'll depend on what's needed in that instance. And so we are certainly enabled to make grants, which I think would more likely be on the infrastructure side. And then we are enabled to make loans, which I think is the more likely way in which we would participate directly in a development project.
Thank you.
But we have broad flexibility to tailor it to the needs of the project. Or the district.
And in terms of the cost of the loans, is it market, interest rate, commercial?
It'll be tailored. It'll be tailored to the project. And so, there are some state programs that do have a set rate. They're usually below market, but they do have a set rate. If we're going off the capital region model, term, rate, all of that is in play. We need the money back. We need some sustainability of the fund, of course. But it's going to be tailored to bring the projects to fruition in the near term. Yeah.
Oh, Megan.
Megan?
Hi, quick question. I was just wondering, when we're looking at whether the zoning regulations will substantially increase the amount of housing, are we talking about face value at build out? If everything were built out according to the regs, it would result in substantially more housing? Or is there also sort of a feasibility element to that? For example, according to these regs, this type of development would never pencil out for any developers, so it's not actually going to result in more housing.
Yeah, excellent question. And it's the latter, right? We're gonna be somewhat limited in the sophistication to which we can do that analysis. And so, we're not gonna be doing site-by-site pro formas, but we will have some sort of generic modeling capabilities so that we can, essentially, we don't want communities to use zoning as a fig leaf. And I'm not suggesting that's the situation here by any means, but we don't want a community to use zoning as a fig leaf and say, well, no, we've allowed multifamily in this whole area. And if it's built out, it's gonna be, 450 units. And we say, well, yeah, but you've capped the height at 2 stories. You've capped the density at a small number. No one is ever gonna build any one of these projects. So no, it's not real. So it's to the best degree that we can at this scale, and given our geographic purview, we'll do some vetting to make sure that it's reasonable. And it's true on the other side, to be honest. I mean, I've worked a lot in the cities where, yeah, some of the zoning allows you to go to the sky, when at the end of the day, no one's gonna build anything concrete in cities not to be named in the near future. It's gonna be stick built, right? So we'll have some of those assumptions based on local rents and local sales price and local cost of construction.
Thank you.
Turn that TV off.
Nick, second question. On this whole issue about assistance in planning.
Yeah.
Thinking through your 4 steps, clearly, there's the opt-in step. But at that point, is that where then the town sits down with you and or others and says, okay, here's what we want to do. Here's as far as we've got the capacity to take it, but we need additions. So is that where
Yes.
you then would tap your various consultants and say,
Yes.
hey, work with Old Saybrook, let's see what we can come up
Yes.
with?
Yeah, and to be clear, we still need to figure out some of the details on, is that gonna be 100%, given to the municipality? Is there gonna be some level of cost share? There's a lot of details there to work out, but yes, that is the stage at which we would be working together to figure out how far the municipality has been able to get on its own, what's holding it back from getting to the next step, and what from our team we could mobilize to get through that hurdle.
Great, thanks.
I didn't know if anybody else had a question.
Yeah.
So just looking at Old Saybrook zoning, and David and I talked, we had a meeting before this meeting. We talked about some of the issues because we don't have sewers, it's all soil based. So for Old Saybrook, if you were to opt in, and I'm gonna pick on the B1 zone, which is Main Street, which I would consider part of our downtown, even though, some areas may be a little bit further than the half a mile. We put in regulations to allow for mixed use apartments and housing. You can put second stories, you can have multiple units. So a regulation like that may be something that we have in place that we can kind of extend,
Awesome.
the downtown, or potentially, and I know you can't commit.
Yep.
or we have incentive housing zoning regulations, which we are a little frustrated with. That may be something too, if they were to land, or is it just something you kind of draw the line, or do we have to land the zones for zoning?
So,
Do your zones have to be exactly what's on the zoning map if it's a map change, so to speak?
yeah, so I'll answer two different ways. First, yeah, what you're describing is absolutely right? We would look at the existing zoning, we would try and figure that out together. If there's a zone that already, is close or at where we would want it to be, then we would leverage that as the tool. Yes, that said, by statute, before we can enter into the MOU and develop the district boundaries, the zone that we have certified would be, a housing growth zone must be enacted. Which isn't to say that you couldn't start, let's take the B1 as an example, right? Let's say that we sit down and we say, yeah, B1's good. We would be limited in drawing the district boundaries around where the B1 is today. But then should it be mapped to someplace else, then we could change the district boundaries to encompass that other area. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. So we could potentially, with some of the regulations in place, we may qualify and then work with you to kind of determine, okay, can we tweak things in areas that won't qualify, expand that zone as we go? So it doesn't
Correct.
have to be perfect to start.
We definitely, that's a great question. No, we wouldn't come in and say, here's the standard that we ultimately want to get to with you, and we're not drawing the district boundaries until you reach that. No, we would absolutely say, yeah, okay, here's where we start together based on what you have today, and here's how we'll evolve together and incrementally, change the MOU, evolve the MOU over time.
So in a perfect world, in a perfect municipality, and you looked at everything, so this is great, and you draw the zone. I think a lot of municipalities have the issue, it's the private property owners that don't budge. So there's, I think, a lot of opportunities to expand housing and diversity in housing, different types of housing. It's getting the developer or the property owner to buy it. So that's something else that you could help us.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to overpromise on that because it's a tough one, but we will do our best to help. And part of it might be matchmaking, helping existing owners understand that they can retain an equity stake, by partnering with a developer and not having to take it on themselves, but could benefit on the upside, right? Maybe exploring some of those different models with folks, but we'll help as best as we can.
I think, Chris, that would be a similar challenge to the way that the railroads, excuse me, the way the railroads laid out there for us. As you can see, as you look at the town, it's kind of cut us off. And so the backside, if you will, or the north side of the tracks, as well as connecting to Meridor Way, is a big infrastructure challenge for us and maybe presents a real opportunity.
Yeah, and again, I don't wanna raise expectations, but I'm cautiously optimistic that as we identify those kinds of challenges, that could unlock more housing opportunities in communities that have the support for it. Having, an MRDA district with a strategy in place will make us all the more competitive to together seek out various state or federal funding for those pieces of infrastructure if we can't fund them on our own.
Any other questions? Awesome, no?
I thought there'd be a lot more questions. I told our next agenda item to come at 7 because I thought we'd be really
Oh,
in depth with this.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
can you send us that resolution
Yeah,
when it's
absolutely.
ready in the?
Yeah, it's ready, I'll send it tomorrow.
Okay, that's awesome.
Great. Look forward to it. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the
Thank you
time
all.
to join us tonight.